Welcome to Shareholders of a Better World, brought to you by TBLI Group. At TBLI Group, we have an established reputation as an organization dedicated to building the ecosystem of global sustainability and impact investing. We're doing this through educating, advising, and facilitating transactions in global sustainability and impact business, as well as capital solutions for private companies, family offices, and fund groups. For nearly 25 years, TBLI Group has created a vertically integrated ecosystem of education to action through TBLI conferences and TBLI consulting. More about our company can be found at tbligroup.com. This webinar is brought to you by TBLI Foundation, which hosts educational learning experiences dedicated to a better planet. Through the foundation, we build sustainable communities by sharing the people and the experiences making a difference to so many of our lives around the world. Our weekly podcasts bring impact thought leaders that are doing and not only chatting. Now let me introduce my guest today. Okay, good afternoon from our roving studio in Stockholm. We're on the road this time. For those of you who've never joined us before, if you have a question or a comment, just post it in the lower right-hand corner, and we'll get to that. If you need to send a private message, move your mouse over the person's name and a window will pop up to send them a private message. So I am incredibly honored today to have one of the superstars of the financial industry, Desiree Fixler, who is Global Sustainability Officer, former Global Sustainability Officer of DWS, and did such a great job there that they got rid of her. And she's going to share her journey and the work that she's done in trying to really push the agenda. And she's been in the space 20 years, so she's really a long time committed to sustainable investment. And she'll share her experiences of trying to do the right thing at a major asset manager, and what did she experience, and how can we kind of still scale this work for her. Desiree, thank you so much. I'm going to go on mute, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Thank you for having me. I think in our conversation, before we kick this off, one question you asked, she said is an obvious question. DWS has come out to say that ESG is at the core or at the heart of everything they do. It's a top priority at the firm. They made a big splash with my hire. So why did they fire me? What happened? And, let's just say I have a hunch, but I'll never, exactly know what happened. But how I would address it is to say that, look, ESG is a long-term commitment. It is, it's a nascent, it's a market in its infancy, and it requires a great deal of investment. There are a lot of challenges here as an asset manager. You're dealing in a world that, lacks definition. It lacks reporting standards, for companies for your investments. So you're dealing with incomplete data sets. Impact measurement, is just being built out. And then you have the real world challenges. Let's just say, you're set up in a very traditional way. How do you accommodate, securities lending, right? How do you develop a new framework for collateral that is compliant with your ESG criteria? How do you ensure that, at the right time, you retain your voting rights to vote in support of ESG? There are natural conflicts that start rippling through the platform. As an example, let's just say you're pitching, or you have, the mandate for Volkswagen's, pension fund, and then Dieselgate breaks out, right? And so on the one hand, and you have investments in Volkswagen, in your regular way portfolios, how do you manage that relationship? Because on the one hand, of course, you need to vote in support of good governance. You need to engage, in support of good governance. But yet, it's, on the other side, your sales force, is very protective, and focused on the client, on the pension fund. And so, as a sustainability officer or as, a CEO or member of the board, there are, a great, deal of very complex issues that you have to handle. If you make a commitment to go fully ESG, what do you do with your Russia fund? That's based on, listed equities, and that's not terribly clean, and it's not obvious, right? How, what benchmark you choose, right? For that fund, or, if there are viable ESG investments there. Right. And then you have to work on yourself. So whatever you're promoting globally with regard to climate action or with regard to inequality, you have to do yourself as a company. Right. So there's tremendous pressure to commit to go net zero. And as we know, that's a commitment, where you're committing, to go net zero by 2050. But in the meantime, there's pressure to create interim targets and report out on your progress. And then there's the diversity issue. We know that in finance, it's a struggle, particularly when you look at the senior ranks, you look at front office. So, what I would say is that, when, there's a way sometimes, folks just look at ESG and just say, oh, this is a great, marketing opportunity. It's we can create some very interesting products. There's tremendous investor demand out there. But we've moved from a world of ESG euphoria, right? And we're now in a world of, unfortunately, because greenwashing is so pervasive. We're now, and this incident, of course, has happened, and we've got others that have commented, like, Tariq Fancy, right? His views on the industry, skepticism and cynicism has seeped in here. So, your approach to ESG or impact investing, has to be very focused on, on authenticity, right? And it's okay. Absolutely. I just laid out all the challenges. It's okay, to lag. It's okay even to make mistakes, to have problems, to adapt to this market slowly. Where it's dangerous and extremely harmful is when you cross that line, and that's very much about what my allegations are about. You cross the line into misrepresentation, where you're saying one thing externally and doing another thing internally. When you're aware that you might lag or you have deficiencies in certain areas, and yet externally promote it as, super world class and leading, right? When, you're not sure about the label of a product, but you go ahead and slap on a green label, or, talk about an ESG best-in-class portfolio as aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals, right? These are areas where you're crossing lines, right? It's no longer an issue of struggling with lack of clarity in the market, but it's now an issue of being aware of your shortcomings, right? But pretending they're not there outside. And, I think in this market, when you make ESG statements and you talk about the importance of saving, the environment and, and rooting for social justice, I think that, a lot of senior executives feel, that's a nice statement. It pulls at the heartstrings, and it's what investors, consumers, want to hear. And somehow, right, folks are forgetting it is a statement, right? And you're putting labels on products, and you have marketing material and it's still regular way finance. Just because it's a warm and cuddly topic doesn't mean you don't have to adhere to securities laws, right? And you have to ensure that everything that you say to your stakeholders, whether it's your shareholders or it's your investors, there's evidence and there's data behind it, right? Just because it's ESG and there might not be clear definitions market-wide on what ESG integration is or what comprises an ESG dedicated fund. If you yourself have defined it, you better make sure that you're doing it. So that is a point I really wanted to clear up, is that while certainly there are aspects of greenwashing in my allegations, but truthfully, my story, I believe, is about failure of corporate governance, that the most senior people were aware of the deficiencies and yet still made public statements in contrast. So this is about, truthfully, just bad corporate governance hidden behind, some ESG bluster.
Okay, thank you. But they, you wouldn't sign because of, you didn't want to put your name to it. I don't know if you're able to say, but on a scale of 1 to 10, how much BS was it? I don't know if you're allowed to say because of litigation or truth.
I can't say everything, but I'd say this. First of all, I want to say that I worked with some very talented people. There are really good people globally at DWS. They are committed to the cause. They are specialists. They're very knowledgeable. And truthfully, for the most part, we worked really well together. There are pockets of excellence at DWS. There's some systematic research that DWS publishes, right? There are some good products. But, as I've said, in the press before, right? Again, unfortunately, taking the example of Volkswagen, here's a company that, still made great cars. Unfortunately, they also made a cheat device, right? And they got busted on that. So at DWS, what I'd have to say is that there were strengths and weaknesses. I was brought in, during a very turbulent time for the Deutsche Bank Group, right? There was some realism when I started there. It was unfortunately during, a scandal, about Jeffrey Epstein. There were some regulatory issues, and unfortunately, one of the spillover things was a threat to shut DWS down, their mutual fund business across the U.S. And then finally, you had Wirecard. And of course, we had a raging pandemic, right, in the spring of last year. And so, it was during this very turbulent time that, I was hired. And when I came on board, folks were open. And again, my starting point was to get to know the firm, right? And I made sure, listen, my eyes were open. I knew Wirecard ended up in an ESG fund, right? That there's something broken here, right? It's not against the law, to make a bad call on a company, of course, and lose money. But it's a very different matter if this company that had a heck of a lot of hair on it for an awful long time in 2020, at one point was a top position in an ESG dedicated fund. Something along that investment process broke down, right? And so I knew, that there are gaps, right? But I also made sure I looked for the strengths on the platform. And there were, a great deal. I just think it's a situation where, parts of senior management let the firm down, right? So I just jumped right in at the beginning to say, listen, right, I've identified these great areas, right? And that's so wonderful. We need to continue, supporting, these areas like the thematic research group in London, and some products certainly on the passive side in New York. But again, I've been brought in, and what was said to me, it's my job description, as an agent of change, right? So I come from a little bit of a different culture. And folks know me to kind of tell it like it is. And, and just, let's roll up our sleeves, let's dig in deep, and let's address the gaps, the weaknesses, and fix them, right? And it's recognized, right? What I still don't understand is right, it was fixable over time, of course. And I guess maybe the company, some managers just succumbed to this pressure to think that they needed to continue to espouse this bluster and propaganda about ESG being at the core of everything, and wanting to be the top ESG manager, right? And using words like we're above industry standards, we're world class. That was unnecessary. That's the unnecessary part. So when you ask how extreme was it, it is a case. It's just like human beings. Hey, no one's perfect. We all have some flaws, right? But what's most important is, I think, in life and certainly in business, is to be honest, is to do a proper mark to market. Know where you stand, right? Identify, the gaps, and roll up your sleeves and try and fix them, right? Don't cover it up. So we started, and I really say we, because, I was alerted to some of the reasons why Wirecard ended up in a dedicated ESG fund. And so, off I went with my colleagues and some of the most senior people in ESG, really to get at the root of the problem and more importantly, like fix it, right? Because it's, we're not about just throwing problems to the management board and shrugging our shoulders. It was like, we understand the onus was on, teams across the platform to weigh in, right, and figure out how we resolve it. So I start this, and you get there pretty quickly that there's this ESG database, and this is ESG data is a challenge, and probably one of the top challenges for asset managers is again the variance of ESG data, across all ESG vendors, right? Unlike financial rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, that has, high correlation with their ratings, there's a great deal of variance, amongst the ESG vendors, right? So you have to be very, very careful as an asset manager not to completely rely, on the vendors, right? You need human touch, right, to come in and conduct your own fundamental analysis, because there will be different views. It can be also a misleading and dangerous situation if you just sign on 2 or 3 vendors and average out their scores, right? Because, you can find, like in Wirecard, right, one company is saying, yeah, it's not so great, but not so bad. Another company say, oh my God, this is horrific, run, right? But you average it out and it still like makes the cut, and it's in that area, right? So, averaging out when you've got, very divergent views on an ESG profile of a company, you have to, you have to review the data, you have to look at all the different views, right? And you have to then put on your own thinking cap. And this is what ESG integration is about, right? And you have to put on your own thinking cap and do your own fundamental analysis, look at the underlying data, not just the scores coming in from the vendors, and make your own judgment call and utilize, right, the information, right? Again, this is the next step of ESG integration is, right, it's looking at material, it's looking at financial materiality, which you then have to incorporate into your own research, into earnings estimates, and finally into your valuation model. And so, along this line, there were some weaknesses in both the ESG database called the ESG engine, which, by the way, other managers, right, have similar issues, right? It's, DWS is not unique there. And then the other part of it, which again is widespread across the industry, some portfolio managers, weren't taking ESG into account. So they weren't complying with the ESG integration policy, which, right, is defined. There's a policy paper online. It's defined throughout the annual report and in other research pieces that you must use ESG data, right? It's not just about being like, it's not about the data being available. It's not the availability of data. It's about your usage of that data. So you portfolio manager, you analyst, have to use that data, and that needs to be integrated into all of to the thought processes and decisions, throughout the investment process. And truthfully, at some point, we're going to stop talking about ESG integration because it's just common sense. It's risk. This is adhering to the fiduciary rule, right? This is about understanding, widening out your risk sets to understand that today there are new risk and opportunity factors due to climate change, due to regulatory changes, due to changes in consumer preferences, right? So it is your duty to identify these newer risks, right? Understand them, embed them in order, right, to optimize financial returns for your investors, right? When when we move to the discussion about dedicated ESG funds, that's different, right? Because that's now subjective. Right now, you've got a criteria of either promoting sustainability or actually making impact investments. And that's different from this first part that I was talking about, ESG integration. So at DWS, right, I listen to how the engine is constructed, and just want to see the output. Let's I've heard it. I'm making a judgment call on the constituents and the methodology of the engine, but let's see some of the output. Can I see some reports? So I pulled the two kind of outlier reports I pulled was Wirecard and Amazon. All right, so let's see what this engine produces. And what struck me is that, for quite some time, Wirecard maintained a B rating. So their ratings from A to F, A being the best, F being the worst. And Wirecard maintained a B rating in a very important category called international norms. And this is a score regarding a company's adherence and compliance with the UN Global Compact. So it's issues about human rights, business ethics, fair labor practices, health and safety, and such. So in this international norms rating, there's a B through June of 2020. So in June of 2020, it's kind of game over for Wirecard, right? Marcus Brown is like being arrested. I think the company even files for insolvency. And this ESG engine is maintaining a B there. And again, that's just one component, right, of what they call smart integration. They have two forms at DWS, which is unnecessary and confusing, but there are two forms of ESG integration. There's ESG integration and there's smart integration. I don't know why there are these two forms of ESG integration. My recommendation was to get rid of smart integration because it makes no sense. But smart integration relies on climate transition risk and international norm violations. So it's a technology company. Climate transition risk was right in the middle of C, but the norms rating was a B, and citing business ethics. Now, we all knew that there were significant risks inherent in this beast, going back to October 2019 when KPMG was called in to do another review. So I struggled to understand how there's a B. Now, at the same time, the Amazon report that I pull, also flabbergasted me. There, Amazon gets an F. So the engine is saying severe risk, run, right? This company is banned, right? That's what an F means. An F rating in smart integration is a banned investment until it's taken to a responsible investment committee and discussed. And there it might be waived, or you might be limited in your investment in some capacity, but immediately it's banned. So I just look at this and just say, okay, so in May, June of 2020, you have a situation where DWS is sophisticated, right, above industry standard, right? These are the words that are being used. A smart integration system is telling investors, go long Wirecard and go short. Get out of Amazon. There's severe risk. This company is going to buckle under severe regulatory fines. There's severe financial materiality risk here. Get out. So, that's the question that I kind of said to the board is like, we're fiduciaries, we're stewards of capital, right? I'm just going to ask you guys personally, is that where you'd want to put your money, in Wirecard, and go long Wirecard in May of 2020 and June of 2020 and go short Amazon, right? Amazon's the prime, it looks like, as JP Morgan equity analyst said, is the primary beneficiary of the pandemic, right? So of course there are headwinds there. You might not want to put Amazon in a dedicated ESG fund, right? That makes a values call. But when you're talking about financial materiality, is this company going to collapse from regulatory fines or from folks, running away from Amazon because of monopolistic practices, right? And the answer was obviously no, right? It was during the pandemic, one of the go-to platforms for vital needs, whether it was food or, cleaning or medical, items, right? This was the go-to platform. And, and again, you're talking about a situation where just looking at financial performance, right? Amazon, was riding on up and Wirecard collapsed. So, just from the output, right? That there's a problem here. The severity of that problem, I did not know. But I mean, it was a situation where it's not that complicated to fix because you've got ESG data coming in. And to me, my hunch was it's a calibration issue, right? Something is miscalibrated here. So, let's all sit down, these reports show it all, right? You can't we can't lie. It's archived. It's there. And, and let's fix it, right? We also knew that, a lot of the portfolio managers, were not complying with ESG integration. And this is common. Believe me, other PMs at other platforms say the same thing. Stuff like, well, I don't want to shrink my investable universe. I'm going to move away. There's going to be, too much divergence from my benchmark. Another one was, quite frankly, I don't believe in it. and not, and misunderstanding, by the way, which is key, that this was about, right? They always got confused. Some folks got confused thinking that, I'm Miss Tree Hugger coming around and I was going to, just shrink their investable universe to almost nothing. And there is that gap in understanding to say, no. This is about the fiduciary rule. All that I'm doing is alerting you on, new financially material risks and opportunities, right? You can still, after conducting, that review and potentially discounting the valuation of an investment, and in your own conviction, right, that this company might transition, you can still make an investment in a dirty company, right? As long as you've conducted, you have sound, right, research, right? I'm actually not, shrinking your investable universe. I'm helping you. I'm giving you further tools, right, to mitigate risk, right, and identify severe risk that you do want to check out or mitigate, in order to optimize your own financial returns, right? So some of the folks, right, weren't listening because they always thought that I was, coming in, or not just me, my other colleagues from, various ESG groups, and that we were going to shrink and harm their financial performance, right? And then we also heard, some people saying, well, quite frankly, I don't like the ESG engine and I don't like the data reports. They're terribly confusing, right? I don't know what you're really saying here. I don't know, if MSCI is right or Sustainalytics is right or ISS, and it's all, it's very, it's not very clear. I don't see the consensus, right? So this is the feedback, that you're getting, from, some of the folks on the investment platform. And again, I've been doing this for some time, and truthfully, I've heard it all before, right? And it just takes time, right? So, when you ask about, how severe was this? Is this as severe as a barrage, for example? The answer is no, absolutely not. Doesn't come close to it, right? Well, I should say, I don't know about their books. Actually, I shouldn't make a comment like that. But to my knowledge, right, this is not an barrage, type of crazy or fraud. However, right, it was clear in meetings, right, where we were saying, right, I did a gap analysis, and then, we organized an ESG workshop group in early 2021, and I worked with 3 board members and the most senior ESG specialists, and another group, which was good, right, did their own gap analysis, right, independent of mine. And guess what? Drew the same conclusions. So we were in fact aligned, right? That, we had issues here. We had an ESG engine that wasn't being updated enough, didn't have enough resources, to run it. There was miscalibration there, which resulted in some, very concerning, signals and reports. Right? We understood that a great deal of the data, almost all of the data, was backward-looking data we were taking in, and that, we needed to evolve here. We needed to find, more, data that might have, forward-looking signals, right? And we knew, right, that we had to work on the compliance of our PMs to integrate. So, the conclusions were, right, the smart integration system is terribly unclear. And we need to go back to the foundation of ESG, and that's ESG integration, right? And our data collection and data usage, right? And there, right, it was, determined, as the Wall Street Journal reported, that, only a very small fraction of the investment platform complies with ESG integration. And here's an important point, right? We couldn't define that number because there was no tracking system, right? So that was a big point that I made to management, is that if you say it, you got to prove it. And you're coming out with numbers like 451 billion assets under management complies with ESG integration in 2019, and 459 billion AUM complies with ESG integration in 2020. We have no tracking system, right? So that is, we need to track this for a variety of reasons. Number one, compliance, right? And we need to enforce, we need to find out who's doing what. And secondly, we need some quality controls here, right? It is what it is. If you guys want to report, and again, that's the other thing, we don't have to report on this, right? It's not, right? This isn't a forced metric. You're voluntarily doing this, right? So the other option is just, don't report out, let us fix everything, and let's, mark ourselves to market. Let's, develop a tracking system so we can verify, right? The use of ESG data either in models or in written format, right? It's easy enough to do, right? There's, text scraping models, and right, there's technology where you can, even though there were, stated over 1,500 strategies, using ESG integration, right? It's technology. We don't have to do it manually. We don't have to interview 800 plus people and go through everything, right? So, let's use technology. Let's see where we stand. And let's identify, right, who's struggling, right, to integrate ESG criteria into their investment decisions, and work on it. But we need, if you report on it, right, that's like I said, where do these numbers come from? You're admitting, right, and in the annual report they write that there's no tracking system yet. They're starting to develop one, right? So if you're not tracking it, how the heck can you measure it and report out on a number, right? So for me, right, this is just, it's a black and white issue, right? And, some people can say, well, that's kind of medium, or that's like a big issue, right? It doesn't matter. It's an issue. And I am aware, and the CEO is aware, right? We're in a management meeting. We're all aware, right, that only a small fraction. And the reason we've interviewed enough people, we've interviewed heads of asset classes, the global head of ESG integration is stating it, right? We know, we've just gone to top PMs, and we know, how much, we've estimated this, right? So, we know we have the situation. We know our ESG engine is not world-class. We know smart integration, right, again, is not super duper relying on forward-looking signals and above industry standards and going above ESG integration. It's not. So, it was what I struggle with in this story is it wasn't necessary to use that rhetoric and propaganda. It wasn't necessary to report out on those ESG integration numbers, but somehow, right, I did edit the annual report and called out, stuff. And the next thing you know, I'm fired. And a day later, that annual report comes out with this, what I see as, very misleading and misrepresentative, numbers and statements.
Quite a few questions, but I want to ask you, for me, the most important question, which is, if the data, which is coming from Sustainalytics, MSCI, Bloomberg, whatever, all of this data is not calibrated, it's not accurate. So the claims of $40 trillion going into ESG, based on the system that's being used now, that's poorly or badly or greatly calibrated. But if we look at the challenges we have on just climate change, on food security, on water, on so many things, I just can't add up. I'm not a PhD scientist. Doesn't add up. You can't have 40 trillion going to ESG if it's addressing these issues. So is our definition of ESG incorrect? Are the data providers not doing their job? Does that all have to be retooled and recalibrated?
It's a great question. And I think, a lot of what I'm saying, and it pains me, is negative stuff. What I'm hoping is that this episode is the inflection point in this market, right? For the stuff, exactly what you're saying. This is let's all hit the pause button here, right? Because we know, right, that we're not reducing emissions, with all of these activities going in there, right? We are not on the right pathway. We know that inequality, right, is pervasive, right? So I think this is the inflection point for asset owners, for asset managers, consumers in general, to hit that pause button and do your own mark to market and ask yourself two questions. The first question has to do with misrepresentation and securities law and this out of control propaganda stuff, right? When you make statements, ESG is at the core of everything we do. When you make statements, it's in our corporate DNA, right? Ask yourself if that's true. Are we living up to it? Are we delivering on these commitments, on these statements that we're making, right? Let's take a look at the label of our products, right? Did we mislabel an ESG best-in-class portfolio, right? And like a lot of these portfolios, we know the top holdings. It's usually Apple, Microsoft, Google, and some, large cap healthcare companies, right? Is that appropriately labeled, right? So this is a question on misstatements, misleading statements, and misrepresentation. Should that fund be labeled climate action? Should that fund be labeled, aligned with this or promoting sustainable development goals, right? So this is a question about misrepresentation, the first one. Are we doing what we say we're doing? Now, the next question is exactly your question. If, let's just say, we have to make some tweaks, right, and change labels and tone down rhetoric, we've actually, we believe in this and our investors are demanding impact, right? So even after the tweaks, looking at best-in-class ESG investments, and that's where, by and large, most of this money is going into, not impact necessarily, right? Are they making the changes that we need, right? So one of the arguments for best-in-class ESG or, ESG ETFs is that, we can distinguish between well-run companies, progressive companies, adhering to great ESG practices, right? So these companies, have a great risk lens on. They're prepared for this changing world, right? And they're adapting to it, right? That's a high quality ESG company, right? So if we distinguish between ESG winners and losers, right? And the market perceives an ESG winner as, operating, in a manner that's better prepared, right, for the future, and therefore determines there's less operational risk in that company. The cost of capital goes down, and likewise for the losers, the laggards in this market, the cost of capital goes up, and therefore there's pressure on these companies to transition, right, and adapt better ESG practices, right? We have to ask ourselves, how much does that really move the needle? How much have we done? Because by and large, right, the numbers that you're talking about has gone into strategies like ESG integration or best-in-class ESG, right? And yes, there's no doubt that there's more money going into impact, but even there, right, what has been, what are the outcomes there? You also hear a great deal of all companies coming out with these great stewardship statements, policies, right? Writing letters to, their, hundreds and thousands of investees, right? And saying, you guys better, go net zero, and you better, diversify talent. What's the impact of that, right? So, take engine number one, super cool, right? This new, right, and on the small side asset manager out in San Francisco, let's face it, brought ExxonMobil, down on its knees a bit, right? And, through, proxy voting and through their collaboration with leading pension funds and other asset managers, it was able to affect, great change. There's still more work to do, right? They changed 3 board members, right? But how fantastic is that? That's an example of great stewardship and proper, corporate engagement, right? And so, as well, we need to, on this impact side, right? We need to be more forceful and focus on outcomes when it comes to corporate engagement.
Okay. I'm going to take some questions because I had a lot of questions, but I want to take some of the questions here. Aaron wanted to know, do we need to treat ESG as a new market? Also, what you describe present an opportunity for Sarbanes-Oxley to create some norms and accountability.
Yes. Yes is the answer. That's a kind of, I'll now lean on Tariq Fancy. And if anyone read Anand Giridharadas' book, Winners Take All, absolutely, we need the public sector to lead here. We need more guardrails. There is no doubt. So while I don't have the view like Tariq Fancy has, that it's a zero-sum game, that what we're doing in ESG investing is a distraction and in fact is harmful because it prevents the public sector from making the reforms that need to happen. But I agree on that absolutely the public sector reforms have to happen. And that for me, that gives the capital markets guardrails right now, to operate within. We need the capital markets to mobilize private investment, into the impact space. That's where innovation comes from. Let's not forget, right, how, so many amazing companies have developed venture capital, private equity, right, and all the great work that's done in private debt. So I'm still a believer, but absolutely there needs to be, more, public sector rules, laws, and frameworks. Yes.
Okay, so Lisa, who has actually the same last name as me, but I don't think we're family, wanted to know, would love to hear Desiree's perspective on whether ESG funds are or can make a real difference. Do you still believe that ESG is the way to go?
So, that's the big question. I do, right? And I think, and I'm hoping that a lot of the BS, bluster, hot air is taken out, out of this episode, that this is the inflection point, right, to do it properly, to do what we're saying. And also we need to move into impact, right? We need to develop impact measurement, right? That's where this market is going. So the answer is yes, I do believe it. There'll still be kind of light green strategies. That's up to, investors, right? We have to, make products our investors want, but we have to do a lot more in the dark green area or the impact, arenas. And there, big focus is venture capital and private equity.
Leonard wanted to know, what do you think will be the tipping point for companies to stop treating these sustainability considerations as externalities? How much more waves of BS sustainability actions do you expect still to come?
Oh gosh, I mean, I don't know. I mean, listen, what we're experiencing now, whether it's from, companies, industrial companies or asset managers, they're what I'm describing, I wouldn't be surprised if it's happening, if it's, pervasive. And again, this is where, when you're talking about externalities, this is where the public sector has to step up, right? Where, it needs to be embedded in pricing, right? Carbon tax, if you will. And so we have a lot more work to go. But to answer that's, I believe, where the public sector has to step in. The PRI has a report on the inevitable policy response, right? Unfortunately, to answer that question, we're probably, this is an inflection point, but we're probably not there to take the real action. Unfortunately, we're going to have to suffer through some more catastrophes and, catastrophic, weather events and social unrest, right? But I do believe that we will be there, right, in the coming years where like drastic, immediate action led by the public sector happens.
Carl wanted to know, is ESG really a good origination principle, or is it just a data set? I would agree for the latter. And what does this mean? And more importantly, how do we fix this? Should we be more specific? For example, saying that we are impact oriented or climate aligned, etc.
Yes, I do. I think that's very important. And there is a lot of confusion in the market, right? Because we bounce around, there's so much jargon, right? And everyone gets confused. And, now we've got the bundle of, the European Sustainable Finance Action Plan coming through with the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, right? And you've got ESG integration, dedicated ESG, impact, you've got Article 6, 8, 9. But yes, we have to peel it back and just say, hey, ESG, this portfolio might not have much impact, or like might be none, but this is a high performance portfolio because it's based on progressive companies who have understood the new risks and challenges today, and we expect them to perform well, but there might not be impact. And absolutely, we have to be far more discerning about what we label impact SDG, and absolutely, we have to do more in this impact space, and it has to be clear what is just ESG kind of risk mitigation, right? And little to no impact, and what is impact, and even there is a range, right? So yes.
Okay. Beata, my general counsel, wanted to know. Actually, I had the similar question. I mean, have you killed your career, or have you turbocharged your career? She has a more elegant way of posting it. What is your next path post DWS? Where are you going to settle? Love to work with ESG whistleblowers. She's a regenerative lawyer.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just in the middle of it. Yeah, I'm sure some people are listening to me, and they're horrified. But one point to make is that this happened to me, right? DWS brought this into the public domain, right? You were the ones that wrote a memo, immediately handed it over to Bloomberg to publish, right? So they took this whole issue, to the public domain, and absolutely, I'm responding to it, but very importantly, I wanted to do this because I wrote a formal complaint to, Deutsche Bank, where the chairman of the supervisory board of DWS sits. I never got a response, right? And it was very detailed. There was a lot of pages, right, on what's going on, and no one was addressing it. And right then, immediately, like in response, rather than addressing the issues, DWS leaks this memo and just brought this whole discourse conflict, right, to the media, and then of course, the rest is history with the Wall Street Journal. Listen, I don't know where I'm going to land. Of course, I want to get back to work, and I've been very fortunate. I've received a lot of support. I'm sure there are a lot of people that are horrified by what I've done, and wouldn't trust an independent thinker like myself at their large corporation. So I'm sure I've shrunk, my employment options. That said, maybe I've opened up new type of employment options and cooler employment options, right? That could be, in more, entrepreneurial companies, or, again, just like what I'm doing now with an awful lot of conversations. I'm weighing in the debate on how we improve this market, how we make, and it's exactly what you said, Robert, how we take, we're mobilizing trillions to go into ESG, but how do we make that money impactful, right? We have urgency. There's urgency here. And so right now, I'm just participating, in these very important conversations, right, to figure out how to work with the public sector, right? We need that dialogue there, right? They need to give us further guardrails and how we can mobilize more money into the impact space. So I don't know where I'm going to land, but certainly I believe these conversations I'm having, will land me someplace, and I want to continue in this field.
Final two questions. Laura wanted to know, what are you looking for in terms of impact measurement to get it embedded?
Gosh, that's a big question. I mean, we need to map this out. I've worked with some incredible impact investing asset managers. And I love their honesty, right? A lot of them come out of the gate and say, listen, right, this is a microfinance strategy. We can show you the impact, the output. We can show you where this money is going, by gender, whether it's going rural, urban, into what types of where the funding is going into types of businesses, right? We're trying to track communities, right? But, it's hard to follow, microloans over 10 years, right? But they are, right, building out, right, the data sets there. So it's still going to take time. Where we are right now, certainly it can be a little bit more scientific, on the climate side. But again, we first have to build out standardization on reporting, right? I'm very much in support of the IFRS Foundation and standardizing sustainability reporting, right? There's just like one template, right? Hopefully internationally for companies to report on. Now we've got, more complete data sets, right? And again, we have to work with think tanks and academics, right, to build out, impact measurements, right? And it's starting, but we're not fully there. So I think it's important, like, to be honest, like, here's, what we think, here's the output, here's what we can define at this point, right? And again, we have to ensure that, whatever we're showing, if it's on the climate side, we have to do our best with scope 3. You can't ignore scope 3, right? And so again, it's about transparency and to continue to build out the science and the data behind it for the impact side. There's still a lot more work ahead.
Final question from me. For those who are watching this live streaming on YouTube or watching the replay, we will send everybody the link to the replay so they can watch it on their phone or desktop. What can they do to help you and the ESG or in?
That's a great question. Speak up. That's it. Speak up. Speak your mind. Right. So, you've got, Tarek Fancy, right, who started this, right? I've weighed in, right? And now there's cover, right? There's an active dialogue, right? You don't have to be as fearful or think you're being as controversial because, right, this is the conversation today. So, yeah, that's what I would have to say. Speak up, weigh in.
I agree, and TBLI always follows Walt Whitman's advice of speaking our barbaric yawp over the rooftops of the world, and it's important that everyone speak the radical truth. We need more George Carlins. Desiree, I want to just take a quick group selfie with everyone who's still here. So just wave to the camera and say hi, and it will collate all of these photos together in one big postcard. And I want to thank Desiree. You're fantastic for what you've done and what you're doing, and all the people who joined. I want to thank our entire production crew, Sam, our producer, Crypto Genius, and Ramen Critic, Ricky, our absolute better half with no filter, Xi Jinping, our head of transparency and integrity, Donald Trump, our gender diversity lead and dog whisperer, Vladimir Putin, our head of conflict resolution, Jeff Bezos, our phallic symbol designer and space explorer, Richard Branson, our low-carbon transportation genius, Mark Litz, our memory expert, and Elon Musk, our humility coach. Thank you all very, very much for joining us today. The replay will be live on YouTube as soon as we're finished, and I think in about an hour you'll be able to log in and watch it on Run the World. Desiree, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for speaking the radical truth. We need much more of that. Stay well.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Finished?